Good evening. I am Ann Wells, the chair of the Filson Historical Society's Board of Directors. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Gertrude Polk Brown lecture series featuring Beverly Gage and her book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover, and the Making of the American Century. We're so glad you could join us either virtually or in person this evening. Tonight's presentation will be moderated by Richard Clay, the president and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. Mr. Clay is a graduate of Davidson College and received his JD from the University of Kentucky College of Law. During his tenure at UK, he was the managing editor of the Kentucky Law Journal. In 2022, he received an MA in English from Middlebury College. Now I am honored to introduce tonight's speaker, Beverly Gage. Beverly Gage is a professor of 20th century US history at Yale. Her courses focus on American politics, government, and social movements. Her book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover, and the Making of the American Century, a biography of former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, was named Best Book of 2022 by the Washington Post, 10 Best Books, The Atlantic, 10 Best Books, Publishers Weekly, 10 Best Books, The New Yorker, 24 Essential Reads, The New York Times, 100 Notable Books, Smithsonian, 10 Best History Books, and Barnes & Noble, 10 Best History Books. She is the author of The Day Wall Street Exploded, a story of America in its first age of terror, which examined the history of terrorism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, focusing on the 1920 Wall Street bombing. In addition to her teaching and research, Professor Gage writes for numerous journals and magazines, including The New Yorker, New York Times, and Washington Post. In 2009, Professor Gage received the Sarah Ribicoff Award for Teaching Excellence in Yale College. In 2015, she was elected to serve as the first chair of Yale's Faculty of Arts and Sciences Senate. From 2017 to 2021, she served as director of Yale's Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy. In 2021, President Joe Biden nominated her to serve on the National Humanities Council, the advisory board of the National Endowment for the Humanities. At the conclusion of the presentation, Mr. Clay will moderate questions as time permits. There are 2 microphones on the landing for our in-person attendees. If you are joining us virtually, please submit your questions in the chat. The author will be signing and selling her book immediately following the lecture in the main lobby. Thank you again for joining us tonight.
Good evening.
Good evening.
We're so glad you're here in Louisville and looking forward to this conversation tonight with you and 500 people who are in the room or participating by Zoom. Beverly, and I'll, throughout the interview, now that you've been introduced, refer to you as Beverly as opposed to Dr. Gage, if that's all right. But
Seems great.
This is really an interesting topic, J. Edgar Hoover. And I'd like to know what led you to focus on him. How did the idea generate? And then also, as you got that focus, how long did it take you to write this masterful 1,000-page book?
It's not 1,000 pages. It's only 800 and some pages. One of my favorite features of the book, for those of you who haven't bought it yet, is that if you buy it, J. Edgar Hoover is going to stare at you from your own bookshelf. That's his eye forevermore, which is a little bit like my experience in working on this book. So to take the second question first, I spent more than a decade working on this book and really living with this man, J. Edgar Hoover. And often when people ask, why did you write the book? What they mean, and maybe it's what you mean, is why on earth would you want to spend so much time with this particular man, who of course so many people think of as one of the great villains of the 20th century and a sort of singularly unappealing creature. And in many ways, that was the reason that I wanted to do it, because As I started thinking about Hoover, as I encountered him a little bit in writing my first book, where he was there as a very young investigator, still in his 20s, I began to think that our kind of one-dimensional picture of Hoover as this villain was true in many ways, and this is not a complimentary biography, but that there was a lot more to say, that he was a more complicated figure and he was a more important figure than I think our popular culture image really gave us a sense of.
I think that's in my read of the book and listening to parts of it while I was driving on Audible as well. It did not strike me at all that it was unbalanced or that you vilified him in any way. It in many ways, I found him a sympathetic figure. Could you talk to us about that aspect of his personality? This was a man with deep secrets.
Well, in writing this, I wanted to make him not a hero, right? This is not about a redemptive biography, but I did want to make him a human being. I don't think biographies are very interesting unless they are, in fact, stories of human beings. And most human beings have some pretty sympathetic aspects. And in encountering Hoover, I would say there were kind of two places that I found myself surprised at how sympathetic I was to him. And maybe these are the same ones that you found in reading it. One was about his kind of inner struggles, right? He's a tightly wound character. And you see this in all sorts of places. You see it in his struggles in his childhood, particularly with his father, who suffered from mental illness, it seems depression in a pretty serious way. And Hoover kind of seems to have taken that and become a striver and wanted to be the best at everything and move really, really fast and kind of make his career. But then throughout his life, he's really anxious. He's, of course, concerned, and we might talk about this, about rumors about his sexuality. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which he's just a sort of anxious creature. And I had some sympathy for that. And then there were lots of moments where it turned out J. Edgar Hoover did some pretty good things, which I hadn't known as much about. And so there are these moments where he takes what were sometimes kind of brave stands that have stood the test of time. I didn't expect that going in, but there are quite a number of them.
And we'll get to those. How long was he director of the FBI, and how did he come to that position? And then also, how many presidencies did he outlast?
So many, many, many is the quick answer. But this story, the sheer scope of his career was really another thing that drew me into wanting to write about him. So he became the director of the FBI at the age of 29 in 1924. And then he stayed in that job for the next 48 years. Until 1972, when he died in that job, so was never fired from the position. What that means in terms of presidents is that he served under a total of 8 presidents, 4 of them Democrats and 4 of them Republicans, which is, of course, interesting in our own moment where that sort of thing seems impossible. And just to finish off the scope of this man's career, it means that he was there. He was appointed under Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s. He stayed there under Herbert Hoover in at the dawn of the Great Depression. He was there for 3+ terms of Franklin Roosevelt, so the New Deal, the Second World War. He stayed on under Harry Truman, so the dawn of the Cold War, McCarthyism. 2 terms of Dwight Eisenhower, stayed on under John Kennedy, stayed on under Lyndon Johnson and the civil rights transformations of the 1960s, and then was there for most of Richard Nixon's first term and died right before Watergate. So it's an incredible scope. He's interesting as a man, but I also wanted to tell this big story about the 20th century.
I found it interesting that he was a homegrown Washingtonian and the descendant of a family of civil servants. How did that influence him? And growing up in DC?
Yeah, this is really a book about Washington. Hoover was born there, he died there, he never lived anywhere else, and he only lived in two houses. He lived with his mother until he was 43 years old.
At her death.
At her death, exactly. And then he bought his own house, actually on the same block as Lyndon Johnson, and they became very friendly starting in the 40s. But so it's really a Washington story, and it is both about Hoover's roots in Washington, and as you say, he was in this very unusual position. He was born in 1895, and that's a moment when the federal government is not doing very much, and a lot of people are not flocking to Washington, which is kind of a swampy backwater. But Hoover came from this family of civil servants and kind of grew up with this ethos of government service all around him, right? Not electoral politics, and I think that's key to the book. But people in Washington didn't vote. Hoover grew up with that kind of nonpartisan ethos, and he held on to it.
One of the central points of the book, I think, is his reliance on men predominantly who went to George Washington University, were members of Kappa Alpha, and it helped also if they were Presbyterians.
Right. I know.
What's
that's
that all about?
That's important around here, yes.
Yeah. I say that as a Presbyterian, but go ahead.
Yeah, a lot of the institutions that became incredibly important, both as models for the FBI and then as sort of feeder systems into the early bureau, were these critical institutions of Hoover's youth in Washington. So he grew up in Washington, he went to the Washington public schools, and then he stayed on in Washington to go to university. So he went to George Washington University, which at the time was basically a night school for future federal civil servants. So he went to law school there, and while he was there, he joined this fraternity called Kappa Alpha, which turned out to be one of the more interesting institutions as I was doing my research, because, as you say, a lot of FBI officials came out of either GW or Kappa Alpha, knew a lot about GW, didn't know so much about Kappa Alpha, but Kappa Alpha was an explicitly white Southern fraternity, had been created in the aftermath of the Civil War, really to carry on the cause of the white South. And at the moment that Hoover entered it, which was the early 20th century, had some very famous segregationists who were among its alumni, and a lot of Southern Democrats who were in Washington in elected office were also Kappa Alphas and were hanging around. So it was interesting to kind of get into segregationist politics, the formation of Hoover's worldview. And he was a devout Presbyterian, went to the National Presbyterian Church most of his life in Washington. His funeral was at the National Presbyterian Church. And he actually, in later years, kind of recruited Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon to join him there.
So we have the fraternity, we have the church, we have the hires that he made. Talk to us briefly about his sexuality and how that influenced his persona, and how he dealt with the public relations fear that he had that it might flow back in that day.
Well, the most famous story, of course, about Hoover's sexuality is the idea that he wore women's dresses. This is a story that came out in the early 90s from an earlier biography. And when you look at that particular rumor, which is often the first thing that people ask me, is it really true? We don't actually have much evidence to support that. So I would put that set of ideas aside. But the question of Hoover's sexuality is really very interesting. The main relationship of his adult life was with Clyde Tolson, who was his number 2 at the FBI, was a GW graduate, right? Was a kind of perfect specimen of FBI agent as Hoover envisioned it. But they were together also basically as social partners for more than 4 decades. And in trying to sort out what all of this meant, one of the things that was really interesting to me was just how open their social partnership was. So if you lived in Washington or LA or New York, the places that they liked to go together, you would have regarded them as a kind of a social couple. They traveled together, they had all of their meals together. When members of the family died, they went to the family funerals together. They sometimes signed Christmas cards together. And all of this was very widely reported. And so on the one hand, it's a very public relationship. And then there are pieces of it that are much harder to get at. What did it actually mean to them? Was this actually a sexual relationship? And there, I did the best I could with the evidence that I had. I think we don't know in any definitive way if it is a sexual relationship. It's clear that they felt deep affection for each other. And one of the things that is actually really lovely to me about the physical book, although I also like the audio book, is that we were able to reproduce so many of the photographs from Hoover's private photo collection, which includes lots and lots of really quite intimate and sweet and moving photos of being on vacation with Tolson, especially in the 30s and 40s. And there's some of the best evidence we have of, of the intimacy of their relationship. The last thing just to say on this point is that, of course, by the 40s and 50s, Hoover is very involved in policing the sex lives of other people, particularly gay men and women in the government. It was federal policy that you couldn't work for the federal government and be gay. And so the FBI was doing a lot of that policing, and Hoover was using the FBI to police the rumors about his own sexuality. So if you, were at a dinner party and said, hey, I hear this thing about the FBI director, you might in fact get an FBI agent knocking on your door. So it's a very complicated story, but I tried to stick with the evidence that we have and not go beyond that, but there's quite a lot of it.
It was a complicated story, and it seems interesting that the press back then seems to have given him a pass, that they were not invasive into his private life. We've talked about the presidents that he circumnavigated. Let's talk about his relationship, I think let's start with FDR. A 12-year relationship between two control freaks and two highly, bright, dedicated men. How did that play out? And how did FDR use Hoover, and how did Hoover use FDR?
Well, the short answer is that J. Edgar Hoover would not have become J. Edgar Hoover without FDR. And one of the things that turned out to be really interesting in looking at these presidential relationships was that it's the two great liberal presidents of the 20th century, right? It's Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, who in a formal sense do the most to give Hoover and the FBI the powers that it has today, and to empower Hoover himself in a very personal way. So I think he was a little different than Roosevelt, who liked to have lots of different advisors with lots of different opinions, kind of pit them against each other, et cetera. Hoover was a very different sort of leader. He wanted everyone to agree with him at all times. He had a long manual of rules, how you were supposed to dress, what you were supposed to think, and that was sort of the ethos of the FBI. But Roosevelt did three really important things for Hoover. One, it is during the Roosevelt years that the FBI moves into crime fighting in a serious way and gets its name, the FBI. It's when they become known as G-men. So the book is called G-Man, which stands for Government Man, the nickname of FBI agents in the 30s. So they begin to carry guns, really engage in gangster fighting for the first time in a serious way. Figures like John Dillinger. That happens under Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt pushes them into public relations, which he was very good at. One of his big insights, which Hoover very much took to heart, is that the work of government is not self-evident. You have to explain it to people. You have to sell it to people if you want people to support you. So Roosevelt was good at that. Hoover became very good at it too. And then the last thing that he does is he really pushes the FBI into political intelligence, which Hoover had done some of early on as a young man, but the FBI had been a little bit out of in the 20s. Roosevelt pushes Hoover back into the world of domestic intelligence, and that means everything from surveillance of fascist and communist movements, espionage cases, and it also means doing political favors for none other than Franklin Roosevelt, and keeping track of some of his enemies and critics.
During the Roosevelt presidency, of course, we had World War II, and the episodes of foreign nationals in the United States and the detentions, arrests, and incarcerations. What was Hoover's role in all of that?
So he had a really fascinating role in the Second World War overall, but particularly in the internment question. So the Second World War is boom times for the FBI, as for almost every other part of the government. It quadruples in size. It never shrinks back down. It just becomes this big institution for the first time. But when it came to internment, two things happened. One is that the FBI, the moment Pearl Harbor happened, put its own internment program into effect. So they started arresting specific individuals that they had deemed dangerous, Japanese, but also Italian and German non-citizens from belligerent nations. When Japanese internment of the mass scale, the sort that we tend to think about when we talk about World War II internment, when that came along a few months later, Hoover was one of the few officials who spoke out against it. And he did that for a number of reasons. He thought it was unconstitutional because about half of the people about to be interned were American citizens. He thought that it was politically unwise. He thought that it was racist and that race wasn't a very good proxy in this case for deciding who was dangerous. Most of all, he thought it was impugning the FBI, because if you say we have to arrest everyone and intern everyone, you're suggesting that J. Edgar Hoover can't just tell you who's dangerous and pick out the specific individuals. So he had lots of reasons for opposing Japanese internment, but he was one of the few federal officials who did it.
Then FDR dies. And is it fair to say that Harry Truman was Hoover's least favorite president? I thought so.
That's fair.
I got that from the book. We had the OSS, and it leads to the CIA. And talk to us, if you would, about how Hoover, his role in international intelligence and espionage, and what he wanted and what he didn't get.
A lot of his story under Roosevelt had been big crisis comes, the crisis is crime, the crisis is the war, whatever it might be. Hoover says, I can take care of that for you. Franklin Roosevelt says, go at it. And so the FBI had been expanding, and he sort of assumed that that would continue when the war came to an end. During the war, Roosevelt had given the FBI jurisdiction over Latin America, so the whole Western Hemisphere. The OSS was everywhere else, but the FBI had started to move beyond US borders, and Hoover was proud of what they had done, though it took them a while to figure out what they were doing. So when the war came to an end, he said, well, this has worked out really well. We're going to need a peacetime intelligence agency. It should be me, and I should be able to run intelligence worldwide. Harry Truman says no. That's how we get the CIA. Hoover never forgives him, and he tells his agents in Latin America and South America to just burn everything and come on home, and let the next guys start from scratch. And the FBI and the CIA were sort of at loggerheads from that moment forward.
You said at the beginning that there were things that you found that made you see admirable qualities in him. I assume that one of those would have been the civil libertarian streak that manifested itself during World War II with the internment programs, what other attributes did you see or actions that he took that were, in your mind as a historian, distinctly admirable about him?
Well, I would say, first of all, he was a very capable administrator, and he couldn't have done what he did over all of this time without having some real bureaucratic talents. Now, we can argue over whether they were used for good or for ill, but he was a capable person, and it's where, particularly in the first decades of his career, it's where he got a lot of the trust and power that he ultimately exercised. I think we often have sort of an image of Hoover and the late Hoover that says his power came from, his secret files and having information on everyone in Washington and blackmailing them and strong-arming them. And there is some truth to that, particularly in the later years, but it doesn't actually explain, how as a very young man, he kind of negotiated this very complicated political scene and also built an institution with real lasting power with incredible loyalty from the people around him. I mean, he had his critics, but his secretary was with him for 55 years. Tolson was with him for more than 4 decades. A lot of his agents really had a lot of faith in him. So I think we have that side. And then there are some interesting moments that I think are really counterintuitive. But when Hoover's doing some pretty good work on civil rights, now we can get into all the really terrible things he did around civil rights. But in the 40s, for instance, he mounts a pretty aggressive campaign against lynching,
Right.
Trying to make lynching investigations at a moment when that was pretty hard to do for a variety of reasons. And then in the 1960s, even as he is infiltrating and going after the civil rights movement, people like Martin Luther King, he's doing similar things to the Ku Klux Klan, to white supremacist organizations. And I think in a lot of those cases, he had a set of ideas about violent threats, right?
Mhm.
People who committed acts of violence and acted as vigilantes and who defied federal power. And in those cases, he was going to come in and kind of bring down the wrath of the FBI on you, no matter what he thought about your kind of broader politics.
Go, if you would, we're still in the Truman years, and we have the emergence of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and then in the Senate, we have Joe McCarthy, and all of this extends from the Truman administration into the Eisenhower administration. Talk to us about Hoover's role in that and how he saw communism.
This is some of my favorite material in the book. I teach a class at Yale called Communism and Anti-Communism in the 20th Century US, in part because I think it was so central, right? This question of the struggle against communism was so central to nearly everything in American politics during the 20th century in a way that it's not anymore. And it's sort of one of these really key themes to the whole century. And it was absolutely key to Hoover's life. I mean, he is a devout anti-communist, and in many ways, is the person who embodies big anti-communist themes. A couple of things that were particularly interesting to me about those years. One is how he built his relationships with Congress. So he had a president who he didn't like and who didn't like him very much. So he said, aha, well, I've got lots of friends on Capitol Hill, and I will go work with them if the White House isn't going to cooperate with me. And so he builds up these very tight relationships with congressional committees like the ones you described, and he in fact staffs them with FBI agents, the Appropriations Committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, either current agents or former agents. And so he just has this amazing conduit into kind of everything that's going on in Congress that he cares about. And then the other really interesting piece of that to me was his relationship with Joseph McCarthy. So they were friends, they obviously shared a lot of a certain basic anti-communist outlook, but Hoover was actually pretty critical of McCarthy. in many ways helped to bring McCarthy down because he thought of McCarthy as kind of a demagogue and a liar and someone who was a loose cannon and you never knew what he was going to say. And the worst things to J. Edgar Hoover that Joe McCarthy said were, by God, if we just open up the FBI files, it will show everyone that I'm right. And Hoover said, I do not want to open my files to the press and the American public. So they got in loggerheads there. And a lot of people, including a lot of liberals, actually supported Hoover as the kind of responsible anti-communist in contrast to the, kind of demagogue Joe McCarthy, which really surprised me.
In the Eisenhower administration, he worked closely with Herbert Brownell, Eisenhower's Attorney General, who was so instrumental in history in getting federal judges appointed in the South who were champions of civil rights. Did you, well, in your book, how do you come out with the relationship between Hoover and Brownell, and now take us into the civil rights movement and and the good things Hoover did and the not so nice things?
Right. Well, the Eisenhower years, and this includes Brownell, were, I think, sort of Hoover's glory years in lots of ways. He had a White House that loved him, that wanted to kind of promote him as standing for many of the things that they stood for. He got very close to Richard Nixon as vice president, and that's a political saga that we can trace out to the very end. As I said, they're all going to church together. They're all kind of moving in the same social world, and Brownell was part of that. They worked together to kind of contain McCarthy, and then they do work together in the 50s on civil rights questions. And I think the big picture of Hoover on civil rights is that you can see beginning in the 1950s, though in many ways much earlier as well, the kind of deep-seated racism that he had since he was a young man. A lot of what the FBI gets involved in by the early 60s is the infiltration and surveillance of the civil rights movement, of figures like Martin Luther King. And this book has a lot about the King saga, and some of its new material that's just come out. But at the same time, Hoover remained quite concerned about sort of white supremacist vigilante groups in the South, and with Brownell, and then after Brownell, did conduct those kinds of investigations. So the citizens' councils, which started in the 50s, the FBI was sort of secretly watching the white citizens' councils in the South, even though they knew there would be a lot of uproar if they did that. So he has a somewhat complicated, or at least a more complicated story than his popular image might suggest, even though in fundamental ways, I think it's really safe to say Hoover was not a fan of the civil rights movement, and especially of King himself.
And we get into Brown versus Board of Education and the theme of massive resistance. Where did Hoover come out with respect to school desegregation and the FBI's role in that aspect of it?
So Hoover would say publicly that the FBI would do what federal jurisdiction allowed it to do. Now, of course, this is a somewhat complicated matter, because in areas that he really wanted to be involved, like, say, surveillance of the Communist Party, he would go well beyond what any reasonable understanding of his jurisdiction might suggest. When it came to civil rights, a lot of his complaints in the 50s and 60s, as he's under increasing pressure to get involved more aggressively in civil rights investigations, and in particular to protect civil rights activists and Black people in the South from violence. He says, well, we don't actually have the jurisdiction to do this. Some of that was legitimate. Some of it was because Hoover really thought that civil rights was going to drag the FBI into a set of investigations, that he wasn't particularly personally committed to, but B, that he thought would really be difficult for the FBI's reputation. And he spent a lot of time complaining, I'm not sure correctly, that the civil rights investigations fractured his relationship with the white South, brought him under criticism from civil rights activists as well. And so, Hoover saw it as a no-win situation and therefore didn't want to be involved, and certainly didn't take the high road on these questions.
Who was his, well, let's go into the Kennedys and LBJ. He had close relationships with LBJ, not so much the Kennedys, is that fair? Right? And by the Kennedys, I mean not the president, but also the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy.
You asked earlier when there were moments where I found myself feeling surprisingly sympathetic with J. Edgar Hoover. Actually, the Kennedy years were one of them, because John Kennedy becomes president. Hoover had been pretty good friends with Joe Kennedy, the great patriarch. And so he wanted Nixon to win, of course, because they were really close. But when Kennedy came in, it didn't seem like it was going to be too much of a disaster for him until Robert Kennedy became the Attorney General. And there's Hoover, this very buttoned up guy, and he's in his 60s at that point. And then he's got this 35-year-old Attorney General who is, full of big ideas and energy. And he thought, you're not qualified for this job. I've been here a long time. And so they have some very funny conflicts over the fact that Robert Kennedy keeps rolling up his shirt sleeves and taking off his suit jacket and loosening his tie, which Hoover found pretty outrageous. But yeah, so they have a lot of conflict, and in most ways, I think Hoover felt quite vulnerable during the Kennedy years. But then, of course, after the assassination, Lyndon Johnson became president. Hoover had known him for a long time. They'd been neighbors.
And they were the same age or close.
Closer.
Yeah, whereas
exactly.
both John and Robert Kennedy were significantly younger. And I would think that would give him concern about aging out into retirement sooner than he wanted to go.
Right. And by federal law in that moment, you were supposed to retire at the age of 70. And so that meant that J. Edgar Hoover was supposed to have retired on January 1st, 1965. Had John Kennedy lived, they probably would have figured out, or might at least have figured out a way to make that happen. One of the first things Lyndon Johnson does as president in 1964, before he's even been elected in his own right, is give Hoover a pass from this federal retirement policy, and basically allows him to be FBI director for life. Now, I'm not sure that was a favor to Hoover, because it's in those years from 64 onward that he really becomes the most controversial. And when we get kind of the reputation that we know today, and when the FBI does some pretty outrageous things.
And let's talk about that. The years 64 to 68, the Johnson presidency, the incredible divisions in American society, both with civil rights, but also with Vietnam, and a president flawed, but truly significant. How did Hoover handle what he considered to be threats in American life during the Johnson presidency?
Well, he and Johnson were close for all of Johnson's presidency. And if you look at, kind of Johnson's tapes in 1968 and even his own memoirs and recollections, when Richard Nixon is elected, Johnson says to him, Edgar Hoover's the only man you can trust in Washington. And Dick Nixon says, I believe you. And then they both call Hoover, and it's a whole to-do. So that's his relationship with Johnson. But these years are the years when, as the country is splitting apart, in many ways becoming much more ideologically divided around lots of issues, Hoover becomes one of those issues. One of the amazing things about this earlier period of his life that I think that we've forgotten is that he was incredibly popular. In the 1950s, if you look at public opinion polls, J. Edgar Hoover is way up there in terms of who Americans say that they respect. and he's getting popularity ratings in the 70s, 80s, 90 percentiles. So that comes to an end to some degree in the 1960s, and often for good reason. And civil rights, and in particular Hoover's campaign against Martin Luther King, which was both a public campaign. It's in 1964 that Hoover publicly calls King the most notorious liar in America, and creates a big public drama, comes under lots of criticism around that, and then conducts a really outrageous campaign of secret surveillance, harassment,
Right.
disruption aimed at King.
And those activities continued on through the Nixon presidency. And he died, though, before President Nixon resigned from office. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
So I think many ways what Hoover's best known for, which are these campaigns of surveillance and infiltration and disruption aimed at the left-wing movements of the 60s, the anti-war movement, student activists, civil rights, Black Power, you name it. All of that is happening under Lyndon Johnson, I should say, with, mostly with the knowledge and cooperation and support of Lyndon Johnson, even on some of the worst aspects of the King investigations. But it continues pretty continuously under Richard Nixon as well. And in fact, there are moments that are kind of funny under the Nixon administration where Nixon is pushing Hoover to do more, and Hoover is actually acting the civil libertarian and saying, Dick, we've got to draw the lines somewhere. And I think what you're asking us to do is pretty straightforwardly illegal, and he doesn't do some of it.
What lessons do we take from his career?
Well, I think one lesson is don't have the same FBI director for 48 years. Probably don't want one individual with that concentration of power. And that's actually something that the country learned even before Hoover died. So as he's getting older and is still in office, there are a set of reforms coming in, one of which now limits the FBI director to 10 years. And then, of course, the Church Committee investigations right after his death led to a whole round of reforms and kind of forms of transparency that weren't there during Hoover's time, including the Freedom of Information Act.
I want to ask you one last question, then I want to turn it over to the audience for questions. You wrote last week an article in the New Yorker that I found truly moving and powerful. And it was about your own health struggles. Could you talk to us about that and how you managed to write this brilliant book with all of that going on?
Right. For those of you who haven't seen this article, came out a couple of weeks ago in the New Yorker and was about, over the last about 3.5 years now, my kind of descent into a world of rheumatological and immune system struggles, which ended with me having a kind of mystery, undiagnosed illness that includes the discovery that I have a genetic mutation, and I'm the only person in the world known to have this. And so I've become the subject of research studies at the National Institutes of Health, et cetera. So the question of how did these two things go together? In funny ways, I actually think having gotten sick combined with the pandemic may have helped me finish the book, because I couldn't do very much else. So I sat there at my desk wondering how well I would be able to walk around. And I'm basically okay right now. It's a complicated story, but I'm fine. But the other thing that was really interesting to me about writing that was how much the biographical skills that I had developed in writing this book, I then turned on myself. So I assembled the known record, which in this case was my medical record, my journals, interviews with people who had seen all of this, and tried to create a narrative in that case about my own life. But I found that both thinking about myself as being in a moment in history, and then having to, kind of create a story out of the information you have and the information that you don't have, it's actually the same process. So that was interesting for me as a historian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we have the lights on? Yeah. Questions? We have 2 microphones set up in these aisles. Julie, could you raise your hand? And yeah, this is Julie James, who's Vice President of the Filson. And so we've got plenty of time. We'd love for you to ask questions over the next 10 minutes.
So
Plenty of time.
this question comes from our virtual audience. Judith Bloor. Did you see any evidence that Hoover had any concern for what turned out to be Watergate?
So Watergate is a funny story because I actually think Hoover is really central to Watergate, though the Watergate burglary did not happen until a month after his death. But Hoover is, I think, central in a couple of ways. One is that I mentioned these conflicts with Nixon while Nixon was president, in which Hoover didn't want to do some of the things that Nixon wanted the FBI to do. Hoover's resistance and foot dragging is one of the reasons that Nixon created the plumbers, so that he could have his own guys in-house at the White House to do whatever he wanted, the plumbers, which included former FBI agents trained by Hoover. So that's one place where I think Hoover is important to Watergate. A second one is that a guy named Mark Felt was the number 3 man at the FBI when Hoover was there. So it was Hoover, then Tolson, and then Felt. Hoover died. Tolson immediately retired, and that left Mark Felt as the top man. And Mark Felt very much wanted to become the director, and Richard Nixon did not choose him as the director. He put in an acting director named Patrick Gray, who came from outside the FBI. Mark Felt is very angry about this and decided to speak to some of his friends at the Washington Post, as well as other places, about the Watergate investigation, and became Deep Throat, right? So the Deep Throat story is from inside Hoover's FBI. And one of the things that Felt didn't like was the fact that Nixon was trying to politicize and manipulate Hoover's FBI. So that's one piece. And then another kind of sympathetic moment. Weirdly, I became very involved in the relationship between Nixon and Hoover, who really seemed to like each other. Even you would think of them maybe as the 2 like least friendly and maybe least appealing men to be in a friendship, but they really liked each other. And on the Nixon tapes, you can hear Nixon and some of his aides lamenting that if Hoover had lived, he would have figured out a way to contain Watergate and contain the investigation. And so you wouldn't have had this disaster happening. I don't know if that's true or not, but it was one of Nixon's theories.
I'm interested in Hoover's relationship, if there was one, with George Wallace, since he was kind of, favored the South and had that, anti-civil rights approach. I don't know anything about that relationship. Can you speak to it?
Sure, that is another really interesting relationship. So in the 40s and 50s, when Wallace was coming up as a politician, and particularly during the massive resistance years, he made a big deal about, we're going to defy federal authority. And Hoover didn't like that at all. And I think it was maybe when he was a circuit judge, at any rate, at some point, Wallace says, if an FBI agent sets foot on my turf, we're going to arrest him, right? That he doesn't want any federal power. And so Hoover doesn't like that. But by the 60s, of course, they share certain ideas, and Hoover is beloved by most conservatives in the 1960s. And Wallace decides that he loves Hoover. And so Wallace actually, when he's running for president, at a certain point gestures and says, well, I'd like to have J. Edgar Hoover as my vice presidential candidate. And Hoover's like, and actually, if you look at their internal correspondence at the FBI, they are talking about Wallace as kind of, out of control. I think they call him a nut. I have some quote in there from internal FBI stuff where they're saying, Wallace is way beyond. But I actually think it was less about they didn't like Wallace's racial views, which actually there was probably some sympathy for, than that they did not like his kind of cavalier attitude toward federal power and federal bureaucrats.
I'm not an expert on J. Edgar Hoover, but I've seen a couple of things that were disturbing that I hope you could comment on. One was a program I saw on television that suggested that he had a secretive gambling problem, and that because of this, the mafia had quite a bit of influence over him. And although he would go after gangsters like Dillinger, he never even would admit that the mafia existed. And I wanted to get your comment on that. And then the other one was something I saw online. It had to do with the Kennedy assassination and a phone conversation that was taped between Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover, where they were in complete agreement that this was a lone gunman, and that as such, it would not be a federal crime, but a local crime that could be handled by the Dallas police force, which all the conspiracy theorists jump on as evidence that there was government involvement in the cover-up. And I just wanted to get your ideas on that as well.
Yeah, so those are, I think, in kind of popular images of Hoover, two areas where there's a lot of material out there, some of which is dependable and some of which is less dependable. On the mafia, so it's true, Hoover loved to go to the horse races. This is where his gambling came from. He went almost every weekend to the races. Publicly, he claimed he just placed a $2 bet and was just there for fun. There are all sorts of kind of backroom stories, hard to say how reputable they are, that he also liked to place bigger bets. And then there are much wider stories, which are really quite impossible, of course, to prove in any sort of way that, as you say, there's more involvement there. I didn't find a lot of evidence on any of that. And so I tried to really stick to things that we have hard evidence on. It is true that he did not, until the late 50s, acknowledge the existence of the mafia. He didn't think it was quite that organized. After 1957, when there's a raid in Appalachian, New York, and it's basically a raid by New York State Police of a bunch of mob leaders all gathered together having a confab. The FBI does get involved in organized crime investigations. Hoover's worried that there's not enough jurisdiction on this front, and actually in some ways rightly so. A lot of what they were doing during those years was very secret. Some of it was borderline illegal, such as planting bugs inside the headquarters of the Chicago mob. So it wasn't very heavily publicized, even within the government. When Robert Kennedy comes in, he makes a big deal of going after organized crime more aggressively, and the FBI does step it up. So, maybe some of those things ultimately are true. As I said, I tried to stick with things that we had real evidence for, and I didn't see a lot of evidence for those rumors that Hoover was being somehow coerced. On the Kennedy assassination, that's a real conversation. And it's absolutely true that Hoover very quickly said two things to Lyndon Johnson. One is, I don't want to be investigating this. I think this is a local crime. And in fact, it basically was. Murder, and even the murder of a president, was not a federal crime. Johnson says, I really want the FBI to do this. Hoover concedes, and they are convinced quite quickly that it is Oswald. Although that's still an open question for a little while. And then once Oswald himself is killed, Hoover and Johnson then decide that the big challenge is kind of convincing the country that they had gotten the right guy, since there wasn't going to be a trial. And that's a lot of where the Warren Commission comes out of. And so the Warren Commission has these kind of competing imperatives. Hoover and Johnson really just want to legitimate the Oswald theory, and then, of course, parts of the Warren Commission and then some in the broader public as well want this much broader investigation. So there are a lot of conflicts there. I do not think that one can then make the logical leap that therefore, the government killed John Kennedy. That seems like a big leap to make, but it is true that they're very focused on Oswald early on, and focused on the question of trying to contain other theories and contain what they are worried are going to be a whole host of conspiracy theories, rather than kind of pursuing all of that through the avenues that were available.
One last question.
Oh, gosh, I don't like that pressure. Okay, I'm a CPA, And if you won't hold that against me, I know the special agent at the FBI here in Louisville
Hoover loved lawyers and accountants. That's who he wanted as agents. So you're in.
that does, the special agent that does criminal investigations for the Internal Revenue Service. It's a very interesting introduction. I'm just curious if you ran across any information on the inception of that relationship between the FBI and Internal Revenue, or how they work with each other currently.
Well, I don't know a lot about how they work with each other currently, but Hoover basically for his time as head of the FBI wanted to take advantage of other agencies and other wings of the government without actually providing much in return. So the FBI tended to be pretty insular under Hoover. They tended to hold their information pretty tightly, and they would collaborate with the IRS or the CIA when Hoover understood that it was in the FBI's interest. But I think that a lot of the other agencies found the FBI under Hoover pretty frustrating to work with because they were so protective of their information.
I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight. And Dr. Gage, you were magnificent. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.